Hello. Lately, I've been eating a lot of salad. This has been part of an ongoing conscious effort on my part to exercise every day and pay more care to what I eat. I know from being alive with myself for a long time, which indeed relates to the root of the problem, that I wouldn't cotton to any radical or branded diet, so I thought it best to aim for modest changes in my routine behavior. I'd already done this successfully with exercise, utterly uninterested in joining a gym and not into sports or indeed anything I couldn't just do by myself. I went through a personal evolution from Wii Fit and Xbox Kinect training before landing on the 7-minute workout. In food, I've also eschewed radical lifestyle disruption in favor of modest changes such as not even cutting out desserts, but just not casually eating cake whenever I see one in a pastry case and eating greens more often. Porcraft is a great recent comic book by C. Spike Trotman and Diana Knock, aimed at folks who, whether by dint of youth or by a change of fortunes, are new to independent living. It offers life advice through a delightfully illustrated Socratic dialogue between two women, one of whom has her life together rather a bit more than the other. It's a book I wish I had read 20 years ago. However, I was interested to see it vectoring the meme that prepared foods of any kind is a poor use of one's limited budget. And it calls out in particular the notion of salad in a bag. This certainly wasn't the first time I'd heard this, and how can you argue with it? It's right in the numbers. To buy bagged lettuce is to pay more for less. Nobody with an ounce of common sense, once presented with the evidence, would ever buy bagged lettuce over whole, right? Except here's the thing. Until I finally let myself move past this thinking, I barely ate any greens at all. Once I did give myself permission to spend a little extra on bagged salads, I found myself eating the stuff every day. This isn't to say Porcraft's logic is wrong. It isn't. It's objectively true. But it still took me a while to realize that I had to give it a little interpretive spin before it would work well in my own life and start benefiting my health. These sorts of things are not always obvious. Sometimes I see blogs as the garden salads of the web, of the social web. It's not the easiest, cheapest way to get a hit of fresh text or news anymore, or to quickly share bursts of textual information without having to actually compose or organize it first. Twitter is amazing at fostering connections and sharing ideas quickly, and I feel no shame or regret over its centrality to my own life over the last several years. But in all the ways that social media excel at connection, they invariably fall short when it comes to reflection. Historians regard the Gettysburg Address as one of the most powerfully succinct written works in Western civilization, but Twitter sees it only as an order of magnitude too long. Arthur Schopenhauer once quipped, "The first 40 years of life give us the text, and the next 30 supply the commentary." When I first heard that, I thought it sounded pretty gross, even fatalistic, and I rejected it on its face. More recently, though, I've encountered a more positive interpretation offered by the Stack Exchange user Medica, who related the quote to Socrates' own words about the value of the unexamined life and suggested that at a certain age, one begins to feel the call to not simply do, but also to reflect. This resonated with me as it reminded me of a brush with oblivion I had late last year when I discovered the origin of the idiom sea change from Ariel's song in The Tempest. And I was overcome by its beauty and deeply troubled by the realization that my time left to discover such things was limited, as were my channels for sharing them while I could. I felt similarly at around the same time when my cat wrote a poem. She walked across my laptop keyboard in such a way as to select and copy from a piece of source text, this being a complaint voiced by a friend of mine in a chat room, and proceeded to paste her selection back into the chat's input field. I will note that her work even has a title. I found this unlikely and amazing and evocative of the cut-up works of William S. Burroughs. I knew that I needed to share it, and I also knew that Twitter did not present an adequate medium for properly expressing this story. Last December, I did something very ill-advised and foolish. I wrote my own blogging engine, which is stupid, right? It's an egregious example of the not invented here fallacy, made worse by my own decades of software experience, which would suggest that I ought to know better. Why would I waste my time and talent when the world is filled with so many great blogging services already? Plerd is my bagged lettuce. My creating Plerd was less about doing more work, less about reinventing the wheel, than finally accepting what was blocking me from writing. My years-long acquiescence of canards against taking a fresh look at established technology kept me away from long-form writing entirely. But not for lack of trying. See, I'm a LiveJournal refugee. LJ is a great system and still very much alive, though its star has dimmed a lot. It was central to my social existence in the early to mid-2000s until Facebook stepped on it. I never really took to Facebook for reasons beyond the scope of this talk. But I did take to Twitter. I love Twitter, and by the start of the current decade, I'd migrated to Twitter as my home. This was great. I made new connections and expanded my reach professionally. There's a reason that even today, with this talk, I use my Twitter handle as my primary digital identity pointer. But just the same, I had all but stopped writing. I mean, yes, over the years, I had learned a new writing craft, which is writing tweet-length hypersummaries. And that is a thing, and there is a time and a place for that. But I keenly felt what I missed by walking away from longer form writing. I wanted to get back in, and I tried so many things. And even though all these platforms and others are great in their own ways, I still found myself unable to get back into regular blogging. The laziest solution would have involved returning to my LiveJournal, and I still do use it, but mostly to complain about my family. It fits that need very well, in fact. It doesn't get much credit for it now, but LJ was an early successful social network, and sometimes I do want to write confessionals to friends and not public essays. Alas, LJ still feels a little long in the tooth, not just in how much of my old friends list has moved on to other platforms, but in its lack of support for writing tools I've come to rely on, such as Markdown, the simple writer-friendly text markup invented by John Gruber. I fell in love with Markdown while exploring other blog systems, and while I could have written a custom Markdown to HTML to LJ client, I'd really rather use a platform that felt more like it had contemporary bloggers in mind. Like Dreamwidth, right? This seemed custom made for me. It supports Markdown as long as you preface your posts with a shebang line of sorts. And it has a built-in tool for importing all of your old LiveJournal posts, which is precisely what I did last summer. And then I proceeded to not use it again. At the time, I chalked up my lack of motion to loserly laziness and my non-desire to use these free, wonderful tools as irrational at best. With the benefit of hindsight, I now suspect I unwittingly felt the tension between these platforms' emphasis on friends lists and social networking with the fact that, for good or ill, I had a new social network and it fit me very well, and no part of me wanted to put the energy into properly cultivating a second one. I just wanted a place to write and share my writing. And this made Tumblr strike out for me too, with just as much personal frustration. I think Tumblr's great. It's an impressively flexible system. In fact, if someone asked me where to start a new blog, I'd have them look at Tumblr first. I host the blog of an annual event I organize there, and I have no regrets about that at all. So it made perfect sense for me to host my personal blog there too. But here too, it just did not click. I find it telling that my last post from 2012 involved a colleague reblogging me, to use Tumblr's term of art. The moment the platform's inescapable social networking facet touched me, I stopped using it, though it would be years before I realized the connection. And new blogging platforms keep showing up, bless them, like Medium, and I've no doubt that more will follow. But even I can see the foolishness in just waiting for someone else to invent a new, inevitably social networking system that I would somehow still like after a week. Okay, well, if I didn't want to use a service, what does that leave me with? Why, installing one of the vast array of DIY blogging engines, of course. I've had reason to install and use either WordPress or Movable Type or a fork of one or the other several times, both for myself and for others over the years, and they are behemoths. In every case, they're less blogging systems than content management engines. They have a level of complexity bordering on multiple user fine-grained permissioned operating systems unto themselves. When it became increasingly clear to me all I wanted from a writing interface was something more like this. Sometime in between my occasional bouts of desultorily Googling the phrase movable type versus WordPress to see if the internet would just tell me what to do already, I discovered Octopress, and friends, this was a revelation. It's apparently based on a GitHub technology called Jekyll, and I didn't know what that was, and I didn't care about it. What I did see was an easy-to-install system that lets you write Markdown posts locally, and it doesn't care what tools you use to do so. I love this. And then you run some obscure Ruby commands to regenerate your blog's HTML files, and then you push them all up to your server with every edit. I could work with this. I used it for a couple of years, and I wrote 17 posts, which is on the one hand an infinite improvement over my then recent record. On the other hand, the system felt, if not a bad fit, then a very near miss. With those command line invocations, I had to look up every time, and the sense that I was somehow using it wrong anyway, and the fact that it was ultimately a system by a small group of highly opinionated hackers moving very quickly, which I respect very much. It still made me feel like I was borrowing someone else's typewriter. I was lucky this past Christmas. It was a time of resetting for me. I had just a month earlier shipped a client project that a colleague and I had spent the last year working on. As you can see by the presence of a carousel, it involved working with designers. When I was a younger freelancer, I'd badger designers to get on board with the same version control system our mutual project's code base lived in. Today, I do not do this. Designers do not know or care about version control as we do. They do not need to. So for this project, my team set up a shared Dropbox folder, which itself was a checkout of a Git branch. The designers do not care about Git, but everyone speaks Dropbox. And this let us collaborate relatively painlessly on a fairly complicated web application. This, as we shall see, would become pertinent in other ways. I'd also, just a month earlier, completed my first turn as organizer of the annual interactive fiction competition, which involved my throwing out, 15 years accumulation of PHP copy pasta and replacing it with a Catalyst application using a Bootstrap front end. Bootstrap is great, by the way. I am a very strong believer in ignoring all new technologies until the stress of your friends' regard upon them becomes simply too great, and that's what happened here. I read the Bootstrap documentation in January 2014, and I've used it with every fresh web project since. This too would become pertinent. Finally, I just recently followed my partner to her new job in Newport, Rhode Island, after living for 14 years in Somerville, Massachusetts. Newport is a great town. You should visit it, but you probably won't visit it in winter because its population drops by a third after Labor Day, and then another third after Christmas, and then we learn the fine line that exists between a vacation retreat and the middle of nowhere. And you can only eat so many half-price off-season nachos at Diego's before the sense of isolation starts to really creep in. Mix these together with the reflective period that comes naturally at the end of the year, and you start questioning received wisdom. So I thought, okay, let's engage in a thought experiment. Let's say I'm going to allow myself to exist in a lawless universe where writing one's own blog software is not a crime against both nature and good taste. What would I want it to do? Well, okay, my fantasy would be something like Octopress, only more so, which is to say, only less so, which is to say, I write and organize my entries as markdown files on my own file system, and then a blog just happens over here. Somehow. Well, all right. What technology might I've recently used that allows one to make changes to a file on one computer and have a completely different computer, one's web server, say, immediately hear about it? Dropbox is not rsync, which is what I used with Octopress. It isn't Git. It is a foreign dependency. It's also, at least for now, a brilliant and subtle system that does just one thing and does it exceedingly well. I decided that I wanted to treat myself as I had treated the designers from earlier, removing as much friction as I could between my creative tool and its outcome on the web. I also figured that someone had surely already built the system. To the Googles, or its moral equivalent. I found a lot of blogging engines that all purport to use Markdown and Dropbox together, and except for one, I knew none of them would work for me. I spent an evening studying the results, and I loved it because it really helped me clarify everything I didn't want. A system supported multiple users? Cool. I don't want that. A system has a rich, web-based editing interface? That sounds really good for someone. I didn't want that. The exception was Letterpress by Wang Ling. It looked very good, and it had a philosophy that clearly jibed with my own. I want a minimal blogging system with a good writing experience, the creator wrote. Only static text files, no HTML generated from a database, no RSS or Atom, no comments, and no PHP. Well, I wanted RSS, but the rest of that sounded really good to me. I wanted to give it a shot, but then I got to this detail in the requirements. I certainly have no objection to running Python, but the program's attachment to Python 3 brought me up short. I didn't have 3, and I didn't want to learn about Python deployment management to install a cat poetry sharing engine I wasn't sure I wanted to use yet. Where very well-meaning friends gestured at virtual env, I squinted into the distance and I saw only yaks, hairy yaks. It also gave me perspective to all the times I have said, oh, just install Perl brew to others, but that is its own story. Anyway, I was done. So what I did was I made a GitHub repo of my own. Let's talk about Plerd. Plerd, it's awful. It's kind of a joke. It's readme.md is the first thing I say in it is that you should go use letterpress instead. The expectation of Plerd is this. You have 3 directories, at least one of which lives on Dropbox. In this case, I put all 3 on Dropbox because I did this before I knew how it would work, and I haven't corrected it yet. It's all good. The source directory holds markdown files. Each file corresponds to exactly 1 blog post. Yes, they are all mashed into 1 directory. This and the fact they all begin with dates are due to an initial idea I had that, since I don't care what time of day blog posts are written, Plerd could let the file system order and organize posts by date via dictionary sort. It could get the most recent post just by skimming the top of the directory by name. I wouldn't even need metadata. I did research. Someone asked Stack Overflow how many times a directory could hold, how many files a directory could hold before things started breaking down, and the official answer was, and that was good enough for me. I added metadata anyway. You can't not have metadata. But I do my best to minimize how much the writer needs to care about. A Plerd source file is just a markdown document, which opens with a handful of metadata lines in the key value format that I ripped off from Octopress, and which has essentially become an ad hoc markdown pseudo-standard anyway. The only required one is title, because at this time I don't care about categories or tags or anything. Plerd itself adds the timestamp on publication, which we'll come back to. Returning to the file system, we have the templates folder, which contains some utterly unsurprising template toolkit files. These are templates that define what a post or a list of posts looks like as HTML, how the RSS XML document is generated, what the single archive page looks like. Yes, there is only a single archive page on the theory that if it's good enough for Daring Fireball, this too is good enough for me. Will this scale? I decided I did not care. Even if this blog became a raging success, I really don't write all that quickly. I knew I would not hit practical scaling issues for years, if ever. I decided that my need to write today trumped the desires of a hypothetical future reader for a multiple-page archive. Anyway, the third Plerd directory is the doc root, which is Plerd's output, ready for feeding to the web server of your choice. Plerd's core process is a daemon called Plerd Watcher, and every time it sees a change in that source directory, it republishes the whole thing as needed. Page for every post, the RSS, the archive, and a front page with the 10 most recent posts, which in my blog's case looks like this. Perhaps you recognize this as vanilla Bootstrap. It is a bit bland, but by using Bootstrap in my templates, I do get a lot for free, including a lovely mobile-friendly output by way of responsive design. Maybe someday I'll punch it up further with my own choice of font rather than Bootstrap default Helvetica or other customizations, but for now, I've been too busy writing. Since relaunching my essay blog with Plerd less than 6 months ago, I've written and published tens of thousands of words across dozens of posts. I would humbly not imply that any are actually worth reading, but I can state as objective truth that few, perhaps none, would exist had I not finally accepted that I couldn't work with the world's extant blogging tools. So here's my workflow for blogging now. I whale away on a markdown file in a text editor while using an excellent Mac application called Marked by Brett Terpstra to keep a running preview of how it would look as HTML. Until I'm ready to publish it, the file lives in a local directory outside of Dropbox where I keep all my drafts. When I am all done, I move the file, which can be named anything, so long as it ends in .markdown or .md, into Plerd's source folder. Dropbox automatically syncs the file to my web server, Plerd Watcher sees the change, and immediately starts updating the doc root. Because the site is made entirely of static HTML, it can take as long as it needs to update all the HTML and XML files one at a time, and it doesn't break the site. So that's me dodging the scaling question again. When you publish a post, Plerd has its way with it a bit, adding more metadata, such as that timestamp. If you use a change-aware text editor like BBEdit, you'll see this immediately in your open document. Per the very first of Anil Dash's 15 Lessons from 15 Years of Blogging, an excellent post y'all should read, by the way, typos in posts do not reveal themselves until you've published. And I know that only publication motivates me to make 100 little tweaks to my post, under pressure of knowing that until I do, all of its flaws lay exposed to the world. With Plerd, every time you hit save on your local text editor, Dropbox propagates the change to your server, and then its Plerd Watcher daemon sees that and rebuilds your blog's doc root, all invisibly to you, the writer. There is no separate publish action, to say nothing of a republish action, and I personally find this to be my single favorite aspect of the system. Dash's 6th lesson, Your Blog Can Change Your Life in a Month, speaks of the value of blogging to the writer, that the act of writing regularly and in public encourages one of a writerly bent to think more deeply about the culture around them by meeting the challenge of writing something worth reading. I agree. And I've also found that the additional challenge of coming back again and again has resulted in my exploring culture more widely as well. Everything from the first half of my talk came from my last 6 months of blogging. Not only have I been writing words I wouldn't have written otherwise, but I've been reading, watching, and playing a lot of source material that I would have otherwise overlooked. I recognize now that blogging acts both as the record of and the motivation for my own continuing cultural explorations. And for me, all this comes after years of resistance to reinventing a wheel. It can be hard, especially after long experience, to see when an exception against a general, perhaps sacred rule of the craft applies to your work. But I would encourage you to always keep it as an option, because sometimes it might just be better for your health. Enjoy your lunch. Thank you very much.